Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving into a massive, absolutely fascinating historical gap. We're going to be investigating those silent decades right between the life of Jesus of Nazareth and the very first texts that actually recorded his words and deeds. Based on the incredible scholarship of Dr. Bart Ehrman, we're going to unpack exactly how the earliest Christians remembered, altered, and, in some cases, even invented the stories that would eventually become the bedrock of a global faith. It's a real historical detective story, so let's get into it. Okay, let's start with a really profound mystery. It's the very first puzzle piece of our investigation. If Jesus died around the year 30 CE, why did literally no one write down a single word about him for 40 years? Think about that. It's a pretty startling realization, especially for us today, living in a world where we're so used to having instant, on-the-ground access to information. Part 1, the decades of silence, the 40-year gap in the historical record. So there is this massive gap between the actual events and the first written accounts. Let's map it out. Jesus dies around 30 CE, yet the very first Christian writings we have in history are the epistles of the Apostle Paul, and those were written in the 50s CE. But here is the major catch. Paul includes almost zero stories about Jesus' life. He doesn't talk about the miracles, he doesn't share the parables, and he doesn't mention the arguments with the Pharisees. Actually, it isn't until the year 70 CE, 4 whole decades later, that Mark, which is the first gospel, is finally written. Then Matthew and Luke follow in the 80s, and John finally shows up at the very end of the century, between 90 and 95 CE. So you're probably wondering, what on earth was happening during those silent decades? Well, Christianity was growing through a massive, multi-decade game of telephone across an oral culture. You see, Jesus' earliest followers were mostly lower-class peasants from rural Galilee. They couldn't read or write, so these stories circulated strictly by word of mouth. And just like the telephone game we all played as kids, as these stories spread across the vast Roman Empire to convert new listeners, they were constantly being adapted, translated, and tweaked to fit the specific needs of entirely new audiences. Part 2. Who wrote the Gospels? Unmasking the traditional authors. We all know the famous names, right? But how did the Gospels actually get those names? Interestingly enough, between 70 and 95 CE, when these texts were actively being written, they circulated completely anonymously. There were no names attached. Decades later, around 150 CE, an early Christian writer named Justin Martyr quotes them heavily, but he doesn't give them specific names. He just calls them the Memoirs of the Apostles. It wasn't actually until around 185 CE, when a church father named Irenaeus was writing, that they were first officially attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That is a full century after they were put on parchment. And right here is where serious scholarly doubt really begins. The traditional authors, guys like John and Matthew, were mostly Aramaic-speaking fishermen and tax collectors from rural Israel. Yet the actual text of the Gospels themselves are composed in highly educated, elite literary Greek. That is a huge disconnect. To put that into perspective, the crucial number you need to know is 90%. Dr. Ehrman points out that over 90% of the population in Israel at that time could not even read, let alone undergo the years of incredibly expensive and rigorous education it would take to compose complex, highly structured literature in a totally foreign language like Greek. It's highly unlikely. So, how did those specific names end up permanently attached to the books? Well, early church fathers basically retroactively assigned them based on logical deductions and floating legends. It was kind of a process of elimination. For example, the Gospel of John was assigned because the text mentions a beloved disciple. They eliminated Peter and James and just guessed John. Luke was chosen because the companion book, Acts, features a Gentile companion of Paul. Matthew? That was chosen simply because a tax collector named Levi in Mark's Gospel is suddenly renamed Matthew in Matthew's Gospel. And Mark was chosen based on legends about a companion of the Apostle Peter. So it wasn't based on hard historical evidence. It was ancient guesswork meant to lend authority to the texts. Part 3. The mysterious Q source. Uncovering the missing text. Now, here's where the literary detective work gets super interesting. Over 90% of Mark's Gospel is replicated in Matthew's Gospel, and we're talking often word for word. This level of exact verbatim replication in Greek proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that these authors weren't just writing from distant, fuzzy memories. No, they were sitting at a desk, looking at written sources, and physically copying them down. But wait, there's a major twist here. Matthew and Luke share a lot of exact word-for-word quotes of Jesus that do absolutely not exist anywhere in Mark. So, how is that possible? Well, this leads scholars to define a fascinating missing puzzle piece. They call it Q, from the German word Quelle, which simply means source. It's a hypothetical lost written document of Jesus' sayings that both Matthew and Luke must have used independently to fill out their own narratives. So this creates a really complex, layered literary web. Matthew copied from Mark, but he also copied from Q, plus he threw in his own unique sources. Luke did the exact same thing. He copied from Mark, copied from Q, and used his own unique material. John, on the other hand, John is off doing his own completely independent thing. Now, to figure out where these written sources came from before they were ever written down, scholars use a tool called form criticism. Basically, it's the study of how oral stories of Jesus took on specific repeatable literary forms to address highly specific situations in early Christian communities. German scholars call this the Sitz im Leben, or the situation in life. Think of it this way. If an early church was actively debating Sabbath rules with their neighbors, they'd shape an oral story of Jesus debating the Sabbath that ends with a perfect mic drop punchline to settle their modern argument. The stories were literally used like templates to solve current problems in the community. Part 4. Forgery and false names. The reality of pseudoepigrapha. You'll often hear people say that ancient folks just didn't care about authorship, that writing in someone else's name was just an accepted, honorable tribute to a great teacher. Well, Dr. Ehrman completely shatters that assumption. He states very clearly, it was considered lying to write a book claiming to be an author you weren't. In fact, the ancient Greek term for this exact practice was pseude. Do you know what that literally translates to? Lies. The ancient world had absolutely zero illusions about this practice. They considered falsely attributed texts to be totally deceitful, just exactly as we would today. And when we apply this rigorous standard to the letters of Paul, historical analysis breaks them down into two very clear categories. On one side, we have the undisputed letters, like Romans and Galatians. These are historically verified as being written by the actual Apostle Paul. But then, on the other side, there are the disputed, or frankly, forged letters, books like Ephesians and 1st and 2nd Timothy. Impartial historical analysis shows these were not written by Paul at all. They were written by later authors who were pushing different theological views, intentionally borrowing Paul's ultimate authority to legitimize their own arguments. Part 5. The fragility of memory, fact versus falsehood in the human brain. I want you to ask yourself a question right now and be really honest. Can you trust your own memory? Let's bring this abstract concept of ancient oral tradition right into your living room for a second. Think about your own brain. How perfectly do you really remember a casual conversation or an event from 10, 20, or 40 years ago? Modern psychology shows us exactly how fragile our brains really are. Studies show that people frequently remember things they never actually experienced, just from hearing other people talk about them. Group memories are incredibly easy to alter over time, and oral cultures naturally adapt and change stories as a rule. But here is the most terrifying psychological reality of all. False memories feel neurologically identical to true memories. Your brain literally cannot tell the difference. Let me give you a perfect example of a distorted historical memory, the famous story of Barabbas. Historically speaking, Pontius Pilate was a famously brutal governor. He would never, ever release a murderous anti-Roman insurrectionist to a rioting crowd just to be a nice guy. It's historically impossible. But symbolically, it makes perfect sense. The name Barabbas in Aramaic literally translates to son of the father. So what we're looking at is a memory heavily distorted by decades of storytelling. It was crafted to symbolize a profound theological choice. Will the people choose the violent rebel or the peaceful savior? Both are named son of the father. Dr. Ehrman summarizes this perfectly with a really powerful psychological truth. He says, we cannot tell the difference between a false memory and a true memory in our head. They both seem exactly alike. So you have to realize that those 40 years of oral storytelling shaped the eventual written text using human brains. And human brains are biologically wired to alter, adapt, and even invent memories. Which brings us to our final provocative question for you to ponder today. If fragile, easily altered human memory shaped the very foundations of Western culture, how much of history is actual fact, and how much is just the story that managed to survive? Thank you so much for exploring this incredible topic with me in today's Explainer. Keep asking those big questions and keep exploring.